since it's Friday morning and our brains might not completely be on, you can go back and watch the recording as well. So I'm glad to see that a bunch of you went to the Write-On talk. So this slide might not be as new to you guys, but for those who didn't, the Write-On is basically this like audition for the journals. There are two portions of it. There's a note portion and the blue book portion, and that tallies up to your final score. Now, no one's final score is perfect. There's no like, 90s to 100s get on a certain journal kind of thing. It's just everyone does their best. Different journals tally different things. Different journals look at or don't look at GPA requirements. I know that they covered that in the Write-On official call. But the note portion is basically writing an article, like a mini article research paper, and all of the sources that you're allowed to use for this mini note will be given to you in like a Word doc. And you don't have to use all the sources. I used, I think, 3 of the ones that I was given, and used other sources outside of that as well. And the blue book portion is a bunch of citations that are given to you, not in the style that you're used to from 1L writing. Like they're not the inline citations that you see, but they're the footnote kinds that you'll see in periodicals, which are basically just journals and other publications. The other items that you'll be submitting for the Write-On are your journal rank sheet, where you'll rank the journals that you want to get onto in the order that you'd like. You don't have to list all the journals, by the way. I know I had no interest in tax, and so I did not rank the tax journal, but some people who like absolutely wanted to get on the tax journal ranked it first, and that did help them getting on. And depending on which journal you're applying to, you'll be submitting a short answer or like a mini personal statement, not necessarily like a whole life story, but just like a question that you'll be answering. Yep, so the note portion is like a mini article that comes from sources that you'll be given on a list. And the blue book portion will be fixing citations that are in the footnotes of journal articles. And that's the cite and source portion of being on a journal, and that's a good chunk of what you do. All right, I'll pass on to Alexa for all these rules.
All right, hi guys. I'm just going to go through some different forms of citations that you're likely to see most often. Obviously, we can't cover everything, and there will be things that you run into on the Blue Book exam part of the Write-On and during your time on a journal that are extremely unfamiliar, and that's just a learning experience. But what I do want to cover is just the big things, the things you're going to see a lot. And some of this may seem like review, but there are notable differences between, like Anoki mentioned, inline citations and footnote citations. So we're going to start out with cases, which is like a pretty big chunk of this presentation, actually. But one big difference that I still have to adjust to sometimes is that case names are not italicized in footnotes. It's so hard to remember. I remember during my Write-On, I had to go back and unitalicize everything because I completely forgot. So that would be the biggest difference and something to always keep in mind. So I'm just going to go through basic types of citations for different courts, which are pretty familiar to you guys, I'm sure. So just starting with the Supreme Court, you guys know the name, the reporter, the year. One tip I have is to always cite to the U.S. reporter for the Supreme Court. So that's, 576 U.S. stands for the U.S. reports. The only time that that's not the case would be when it's not available. So some cases are so new and have not been assigned a citation in the U.S. reports yet, you might have to use the Supreme Court reports or another one, but typically it would be the Supreme Court reports. And then with Supreme Court cases, note that you do not have to put the court abbreviation in parentheses because it's already obvious from the reporter. Like only Supreme Court cases are in the Supreme Court reporters, so it's very clear already. So then we have circuit court cases, which the difference here is you will put like Ninth Circuit or Seventh Circuit or whatever, or the district courts, which I'll cover later, in the parentheses here. Again, it's just the name, citation, and then the year and court. And one tip is remembering how to cite the reporter. So between F and third, no space. And that does get confusing because other reporters for other courts are different. So that's just one of those things you have to commit to memory. And then something that has been huge for me is just remembering where to find different abbreviations. So I know, like, I go to table 1 to find the abbreviation rules for courts and have a sticky there, and I know exactly where to flip. So then we have the district court, and like I said, you'll have a different court name in the parentheses. So this is where it changes. So there is a space between F and supplement, which stands for federal supplement. So that's going to be the big difference. To remember, these tiny spaces seem so insignificant, but they're the difference between a point or not a point on the Blue Book exam. And I had to grade the Blue Book exam, so I have seen it. And I've done it myself too, everyone does it. And then if you look at the court name in the parentheses, we have SDNY, no spaces. But it does get tricky then when you have something like Massachusetts, where it's not abbreviated just by like initials. So you have Mass, so then you're gonna have to do D space Mass. So just little funky things like that are the kind of exceptions or whatever. Those are the things you wanna keep in mind. Always have just in the back of your mind so that you can remember to do that and not have to go searching for an example in the Blue Book to show you that that's what you do. And then getting to state courts, the difference here, so this is a state Supreme Court. You would just put PA in the parentheses, and that denotes that it's the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. You can see if it's the Pennsylvania Superior Court or Commonwealth Court, then you need to denote that by putting Super Court or Commonwealth Court with abbreviations in the parentheses. And then I wanted to talk a bit about pin cites because that's something that you need to remember when you're not citing the case as a whole. So after you put the volume, reporter, the page number that the case starts on, then you also need to put comma pin cite, which is the exact page that you're citing to or where the provision you're citing to is. And when it's spanning multiple pages, then you do a dash in between the page numbers. But another good thing to remember is that if you have 3-digit page numbers, only include the last 2 digits. So here we have 290 to 291, but you will not put the 2 in front of the 91 there. And then short forms, I'm sure you guys have seen them, but the difference here is that you actually will italicize the case name or the one name that you choose in the footnote. And just remember, you can use one party's name and just make sure that it's unambiguous, and typically it will be. And then also you can use id. So these are just some fast facts, kind of like I was talking about with the spaces between the reporter names and the court names. These are just things to keep in mind all the time. So like I mentioned earlier, no italics for case names in law review footnotes or any periodical footnotes. Remember that table 6 is where you can find common words to abbreviate in case names. And then table 10 is where there's states, countries, geographical units, and that you need to abbreviate according to that table. But the one exception is when the geographical unit is actually the entire name of the case. So here you can see Philadelphia versus New Jersey. You would write out the whole city name and the whole state because those are the entire party names. You wouldn't put like the abbreviated Philadelphia versus NJ. And another thing is that the will not be the first word of a party's name. So the example here, you would not put the New York Times, even though I guess that's what it's really called. You would just put New York Times versus Sullivan. Statutes are another big one that you'll come across. So this is the first bullet point is just the basic form of citing an entire statute. It consists of the title number, which is 42, And the titles function like a chapter system in the US code, and it's kind of organized by like subject, I would say. So like all of the environmental, land, resources stuff is like into one chapter in the code. So like if you actually end up working with statutes and regulations a lot, you'll see how they're organized. But that's what the 42 is. And then you want the abbreviation of the official United States code most of the time, which is USC, section symbol, and then the specific section cited. So here we have 4332. And then in parentheses, this is important, and I'm sure you talked about it in legal writing, but you want the date of the code edition. And so the codes come out every 6 years, I want to say. So for now and for a few years in the future, you'll always cite to 2018. And if you are citing, not the entire provision, but you're just citing like one subsection of it, you would add the subsection after the 4332. So you'd have, capital letter C and then little I for that part. So you just tack it on to the end of the section number. Nothing else really changes. And then here is the short form. So you can either do the title or the code number and then the section, or if it's pretty obvious, you can just do section. This is when it has been cited to in the footnote, in the same footnote, or within the preceding 5 footnotes, and can be readily identified. And that includes if you'd used id a few times to cite to it. So more than likely, once you cite a statute once, like when you're writing, you don't have to do the full thing again. And then something that I've actually never done, but it's good to note, because you never know, citing an entire statute. So this is the National Environmental Policy, and you want to put the official name of the act first before everything that we just talked about. And then you do the same kind of citation. You do code number, the name of the code, but then you'll do double section symbols. Remember that, because when you only put one section symbol, you're citing to one section. So when you're citing a span, you have to add 2. So then you'll do the span of all the sections that contain the statute, and then again, just the date of the code edition. So periodical materials is pretty big, especially because you guys will be, writing on a periodical or working on a periodical. So if you've never heard of a periodical, it's just a publication that is published on a regular basis. So this will include law reviews, other academic, scientific journals, and it actually includes newspapers and magazines as well. And so you can distinguish periodicals from other print things like books, because a book is just one thing, and these come out at a certain time. So like the New York Times comes out every day. The journal might be published twice a year. So here the basic form we have is the author's name just in normal print, and then comma title in italics. So the title of the article is always italicized, comma volume and name of the periodical. So what you want to note here is that you'll have the volume, and then we have the periodical is the Pitt Law Review. But if you look closely, you can see that this is not, normal typeface. And I don't know if you guys have come across this yet, but there's a thing that we use, and it's called small caps. So the P is actually capitalized, but then the ITT are in small caps. So you didn't capitalize them yourself on the keyboard, but you changed the typeface to small caps. So for Mac users, I have to look at this. The command is
Command D.
Okay.
Yeah, Command D is the font pop-up box, and you can just select small caps, and it'll change that whatever you highlight into that. And for PC, when you open Microsoft Word, there's a little arrow at the on that top bar where your fonts are. That font box at the top will have a little arrow, and when you click on it, that'll pop up the font dialog box. Alec has a question.
Yeah, did you say Command C or Command Z?
Command D.
D. Okay, neither of them. Also, is small caps for all law reviews that we cite, or just Pitt Law Review?
Oh no,
all reviews.
all law reviews. So in that citation form, when you're citing to a periodical, it'll be author in normal font the title of the piece in italics, and then wherever it came from in small caps. And you can find that in Rule 16.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to also note that this small caps applies to anything that's a periodical. So like Anoki said, any journal, also any newspaper or magazine. So when you cite to a newspaper, and typically, and I'll get to this later, you'll cite to like an online newspaper, but that should be in small caps. So anything that's a periodical, you're going to want to use that. And then for periodical abbreviations, tables 10 and 13 will show you how to abbreviate them. So 10, I want to say is international, but 13 includes like how to abbreviate Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or any other like institution. And then there's also just a long list of words that are abbreviated. So that's where you would find that law is abbreviated L and review is REV. And there's also like journal is J.
If you don't see an institution there, it's likely because it's the same name as a location, and so you'd use the geographic table for that. I don't think Pittsburgh is in the institution table, but it is in the geographic one, and you'll see Pittsburgh is shortened to Pitt there.
Yeah, great point. So I think that's all I have on that. Oh, there is some tricky thing that has gotten me before, but see here, for a law review, it's L period space and then review. But for law journal, which you don't come across as much, there's no space between L period and J period. So it's those spaces that, at least for me, are something I had to commit to memory to always get correct. Okay, so short form, and this is where you'll find something new, and I'll talk about it in a bit. So if it was in the immediately preceding footnote, you can use id. But if not, there's something called supra, which you'll become really familiar with. And it's not used for every source, but it is used for periodicals and articles. And it's a way to refer back to a footnote that already has the full citation, even if it was much earlier. So it's not like id because you don't have to have the citation in the immediately preceding footnote. It's anywhere previously in the piece. And supra is how you do that. So how you use supra is you use the author's last name, and if there's no author, you can use the title of the piece, but often there will be an author. And then comma, supra, italicized, and then you cite to the footnote where the article was first found. So I just made it up here and said that it was note 4. So then after you reference the note, you do comma, and this is if you're citing to a different part of the article. So I put comma at 5 as if I was citing to some part of the article on page 5. However, if you're citing to the same one, you can just say Galperin, comma, supra note 4.
So here note means previously footnoted thing. So in the example, what this means is that like this might be like the 6th footnote, but the 4th footnote has the full citation of Galperin's article.
Yeah, exactly. So actually I have come to love supra a lot because, you don't have to write out this entire article. It's a super easy short form and it comes just as quickly as id. Like you'll know exactly how to do supra after you've worked with it for a bit. So here are internet resources, which is Rule 18. And Rule 18 covers a lot of stuff, but these are some good ones. So the first example is an example of a tweet. So you have the tweeter's name and then their handle in parentheses, comma, and note that Twitter is in the small caps here. So if you look really closely, you can see that that first T is actually bigger than the other T's because the second T's are in small caps, whereas the first one is actually capitalized. And then you would put the date and time in parentheses and then the URL. And then online newspapers. This is mostly how I've cited to newspapers and probably how you will too. I'm not sure how many people really refer to print newspapers anymore. And I think technically there is an example of an online newspaper in Rule 16 because since newspapers are periodicals, they fell under that, but they're also an online source. So it doesn't really matter as long as you know the form. and it's going to be the same as citing to a periodical, essentially. You'll have the author's name, the title of the piece in italics again, and then here you see the periodical name in small caps, followed by the date, and then comma with the URL attached at the end. For most online sources, you're going to attach the URL. And then reports published online, I have found that this is somewhat of a catch-all bucket that I've cited to things in this form with. So it's essentially all in small caps, and here we have a report from the Federal Trade Commission. Note that the Federal Trade Commission's name is abbreviated here, and then comma, title, which is again in small caps, followed by the date and the URL. So like I said, I've used this for things I found online that are not available in other forms, and I have used it actually for a lot of administrative agencies' online articles or reports, and it's come in handy for me.
So for the FTC one, you see that the FTC isn't shortened, it's like the full name but abbreviated, and because they're an institutional author, you can just put them first and not repeat them after the title. So like in the online newspaper one, you see the article, or the author, the article name, and then where the publication is. Since the publication is the institutional author, so like the FTC wrote this on the FTC website, you don't have to put Federal Trade Commission, Consumer Fraud, Federal Trade Commission again. You just list the institutional author first. And when you find the URLs and put them in your citations, make sure to remove the underline.
Yeah, the underline should not be there. And also, I believe you don't want it to be in a blue font either. So just kind of automatically, it pastes in blue, and then when you click on it, it kind of turns a shade of purple. Just make sure all of your text is in black if you are putting a URL in there. All right, so foreign materials, there's not a really great example to add in here because, as I'll mention, there's a table that covers a lot of things that you would run across. So foreign materials can be distinguished from what I'll cover next, which are international materials. Seems very similar, but there is a distinction. So foreign materials are laws, constitutions, cases, anything from countries other than the United States. So table 2 is where you would go to find jurisdiction-specific citation examples. So you flip to table 2, it's a huge chunk in the back, and you can find any country, and there it will have a list of how to cite to their cases, how to cite to their constitutions, their codes, statutes, regulations. Some include internet sources. So you would go there to find how to cite, like, for example, a case from Spain. And they are a bit tricky, and it requires some time to look at and to compare the material that you have and how that fits into the citation. You won't run into this a whole lot, but I will say my experience, when I was an associate editor on my journal, we had a lot of international articles and from international authors, so I did have to become familiar with this, and it was a bit of a pain. So hopefully you guys don't experience that same level of, citing to foreign and international materials, but it is good to know because I'm sure you'll run into it at some point. And table 2 will be your best friend for this. It has almost anything that you would need, but there's also just a set of some rules in Rule 20. And then contrasting foreign materials to international materials. International materials are things like treaties, conventions that are between countries rather than coming from one specific country. And also things from international organizations or institutions like the International Court of Justice, the EU, United Nations, World Trade Organization, all of those types of things would be included under this. And I would say that the most common thing that you would run into for international materials would be treaties and international agreements. So I just covered 2 pretty basic versions. So a bilateral or 2-party treaty includes the name and note that most names need to have an indication of like what the form of this material is. So this is clear because it says convention, and down here we see this says treaty, but the name should always include something like that so that it kind of indicates to someone that it is a treaty or a convention. So here we have the name. This is a doozy, and I took it out of the blue book. I don't know why they would choose this, but Convention for the Avoidance of Double Taxation and the Prevention of Fiscal Evasion with Respect to Taxes on Estates, Inheritances, and Gifts. So that's the whole title, comma, the two parties that it's between. So this is France and the United States, and you would go back to the tables with abbreviations for geographical units and for the international ones and find how France or Spain or whatever is abbreviated. So then you put the two parties with a little dash in between, and they should be in alphabetical order. That's how you decide the order. And then comma, the date of signing, and seems obvious, but you want the exact date that it was signed. And then this is followed by the US treaty source. So the US keeps collections of its treaties and has a particular like way that they're organized. So I think that this is like UST is US treaties or something, and they get like a name or they get like a number, kind of like a statute has something you can cite to. And there's different versions. They're not all UST, as you'll see in the next one. And you can find that in, I think it's table 4 gives you all the treaty sources for the United States treaties, and then it also includes how to cite to UN treaty sources and other like international organizations. So that's how you would cite a bilateral treaty. For multiple parties, it is almost the same. So this would be when there's several countries that came together for a treaty. So again, we have the name, North Atlantic Treaty, and then you would put the article that you're citing to here, and then the date of signing again. And then here you can see where it says 63 Stat 2241. So that is where you put the US treaty source again. And like I said, they won't always have the same little like name in the middle there, but when you're looking at a treaty, it will indicate that to you. Like I was looking at them online, and it tells you what the US treaty source is. But you can also look in the blue book on table 4 to see the exact format to match with the blue book's rules. And then the one difference here is that instead of having, the two names of the countries, you're going to put the international treaty source. So this one was in the United Nations Treaty Series. And again, when you're looking at the treaty, it should give you this. But just remember that for multiple parties, you take out the names of the countries and instead at the end tack on an international treaty source. And like I said, treaties should really be the biggest thing that you run across. Other than that, there are a list of rules and basic forms at the beginning of Rule 21 to show you anything that you might come across that falls under international materials. Okay, so this is where you can find commonly used citation types. So id is found in Rule 4, where they talk about short citation forms. And I'm sure you guys have used id, italicized, period, add at if you're citing to a different page number. Supra, which I talked about earlier, and infra, which I personally have not had a ton of experience with, but it's the same kind of idea as supra. Those are in Rule 3.5, which are internal cross-references.
Infra points forward to another citation that's coming up. And some authors decide to use this instead of just doing the full citation in the beginning because it might be something that they note in their introduction and they don't want to do a whole citation in the introduction. They're saying like, hey, this is a preview. You'll see it in like 7 pages.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then signals. So that's like when you would put see also, e.g., but see. I would say see and see also are the biggest ones that I've used. I have used but see before. That is Rule 1.2 with introductory signals.
And it'll tell you the order to use them in too.
Yeah, there's a specific order that you have to use for signals.
So everybody has tabbed their blue book for 1L. You have to buy it, you tab it, you have the blue book quiz, you've used Bluebook citations the entire year in your work and memos. What I did right before the write-on was I put my physical Bluebook down on my shelf, and I bought the online version of the Bluebook. Can you go next slide? So they come in like 1-year packages, 2-year packages. I'm a joint degree, so I bought the full 3-year package for my 2nd through 4th years. If you're not, you just have to get 2. It's also really ideal to split it with other friends who might be using the Bluebook. I mean, you will be using it for classes like your writing or upper level writing class where you have to cite to things in Bluebook citation form. But this also really helps because it works with like a search bar, so you can actually just search the thing that you're looking for instead of having to flip all the way through. So that helped me during the write-on because I just typed in like, where can I find like see also? So I just typed in see also, and it showed the list of everywhere in the Bluebook where it's listed. I was doing cite and sourcing for the journal this year, and it mentioned the FTC, and I forgot exactly where to find that, so I just typed in FTC to see if there was like an example that they provided for me, so I didn't have to like do that extra step. And honestly, that's just been really helpful as a time saver too. And if you're concerned about like whether something is a space or not between periods, or like you can't really tell, online Bluebook really helps. You can actually like count the spaces like you would on the screen. So before we open this up to questions or let you guys go early, I just want to say, again, there's no perfect Bluebook score. You just do the best that you can do. Some of these citations don't actually have one real answer. They're trying to see how you would work through it and what the best fit is. So if it's a treaty, there's a rule for it. But if it's a treaty that was embedded in a tweet or something, like you would maybe do a Twitter citation with a parenthetical that says like citing a treaty or like quoting maybe a link to the, like you would just have to work through it to find what's like the most understandable way that a legal reader would see that and know where to go to. The same thing happens when you're doing cite and source for your journal too. When you're actually on a journal, sometimes there are just citations that don't have perfect one-to-one matches in the Bluebook. And you just kind of have to wing it in the most professional way possible. So the write-on is like a test for that. How would you do a Bluebook citation for something that doesn't perfectly exist? Yep. So if you guys have any questions, we'll be sticking around. We'll turn off the recordings. Yeah, otherwise you're free to go early.